So in the name of the Society for the History of Czechoslovak Jews, I would like to welcome you all today to the talk by Joshua Teplitsky. Today's event and all our activities are now also sponsored by the Bohemian Benevolent and Literary Association, and that's very nice that we are for the last 2 years under the umbrella of this organization, and we have therefore access to space in the building. Thank you, Joshua Teplitsky, for our invitation. And Joshua Teplitsky is now associate professor and the Joseph Meyerhoff Chair in Modern Jewish History at the University of Pennsylvania. And he came to Penn just this year from Stony Brook, where he was an associate professor in the Department of History and the program in Judaic Studies. He specializes in the history of the Jews in Europe in the early modern period. I looked up what early modern period really is, not quite clear to me, but maybe 16th, 19th century. Okay. He's also an academic advisor to the Leo Baeck Institute and is, to our honor, a recent board member of the society. He will talk today about his recently published book. Here it is, Prince of the Press, How One Collector Built History's Most Enduring and Remarkable Jewish Library. This book was a winner of several book prizes and was also a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award. He is an associate editor of the Encyclopedia of Jewish Book Culture and co-leads a digital humanities project called Footprints, Jewish Books Through Time and Place. I became, as a not an academic historian, familiar with Joshua Teplitsky's work by chance, by reading an article in Forward about plague in Prague ghetto in 1713. This article was published a couple of years before the pandemic started here in New York. So immediately when the pandemic started here, I guess we were the first ones that we canceled a memorial service in March 2020. And I remembered the article and I thought, oh, how relevant it would be if Joshua could give a talk and talk about how people handled pandemics in Jewish communities in earlier times. In the summer of 1713, plague swept the city of Prague and its Jewish quarter. At that time, according to his book, there were about 40,000 inhabitants in Prague, of which about 11,000 were Jewish, most of them living in the ghetto. A third of the population perished during this time. The lecture is posted on YouTube, and I just looked at it, and to my amazement, it has 682 clicks. And to a bigger amazement, I see there is a program on the Czech radio that took this lecture and this particular video as their program. So you'll find it. Today's lecture will be also posted on YouTube, and I imagine more people who are still used to Zoom and YouTube will be able to see it. Today's lecture talk will be about David Oppenheim, who was a chief rabbi in Prague during the time of the plague. Oppenheim was not only the chief rabbi, but he was also a very interesting person. He was a distinguished Kabbalist, perhaps, and we'll hear more, also a supporter of the Sabbatians. I don't know. And he was a book collector. And we'll hear more about what kind of books he collected and what this all means for our understanding of the medieval Jewry. The books are now, he'll tell us where. So Joshua Teplitsky, please, we are eager to hear more about David Oppenheim and his books. So here is a book.
Thank you. Okay, good, this is working. Thank you for that very kind introduction. Thank you for coming out this evening to hear this talk. I hope it won't disappoint and that you'll be glad that you came out rather than watching on Zoom. Let's see if this works. Very good. Okay. So I'd like to take us back to a time shortly before the pandemic, not too long ago, just to January of 2019, to a very important controversy, at least in my opinion. In January of 2019, which is actually at exactly the same time when this book was published or became available for sale, Netflix launched a new television program for audiences who liked watching home improvement style shows about how to live more efficiently with greater style and less clutter. The program was called Tidying Up with Marie Kondo, and some people might be familiar with this Netflix series. It was very popular in its time. The show's primary goal was to help people get rid of the unnecessary clutter of clothing or tchotchkes and only keep those items that would spark joy. People were meant to pick up an item and decide whether or not it sparked joy, and if it didn't, they should discard it. But the show raised controversy when rumors began to circulate that the host suggested that no home should contain more than 30 books. It was then that a tempest in a teapot erupted across the internet, an important place, and all kinds of other social media platforms, especially amongst bibliophiles of all different sorts. And I'll confess, I am a bibliophile as well. For bibliophiles like me, and like for the subject of our talk tonight, books are the very essence of joy. They are the thing that sparks joy the most, and it would be impossible to discard any one of them. For books capture the experience of private reading, of shared stories, and just as often, perhaps even more importantly, the memories of how those books came to be owned in the first place. Now, it does turn out that these rumors attributed to Marie Kondo were somewhat overblown, were something of an exaggeration. But the reaction to them tapped a nerve that I think is familiar to book lovers of all stripes across the ages. A sentiment that was captured nearly 100 years ago in an eloquent essay by the German Jewish thinker Walter Benjamin. So I'd like to take us instead, or to a different perspective, about books and libraries, to the thought of the famous German Jewish philosopher Walter Benjamin, who wrote a short but deeply moving essay entitled Unpacking My Library. There in this essay, and I recommend, if you've not had the opportunity to read it, I recommend reading it. It's brief and so very moving. There, Benjamin invites his readers to encounter, quote, the disorder of crates that have been wrenched open, the air saturated with the dust of wood, the floor covered with torn paper, to join me, Benjamin, among piles of volumes, so that you may be ready to share with me a bit of the mood. It is certainly not an elegiac mood, but rather one of anticipation, which these books arouse in a genuine collector. Our talk this evening is also hopefully not an elegiac one, but rather will be one of anticipation instead, because I'd like to speak to you this evening about the personal ambition, professional reputation, and social networks, though different than the ones that talked about Marie Kondo, of a single collector who wished to possess every single Jewish book produced up to and until his lifetime. His name was David Oppenheim, and over the course of his lifetime that spanned the second half of the 17th century and the first third of the 18th century, he collected some 4,500 printed books and another additional 1,000 manuscripts, all relating to different aspects of Jewish literature and life throughout the ages. And so following Benjamin, I too would like to take this opportunity to share just a mood of what books arouse in a collector. I'd like to invoke some of the sentiments that are familiar to book lovers, but also to place them, to embed them in particular contexts, to learn something about the world that this man inhabited. And so my aim today will be what I hope is a simple one, but hopefully enriching at that. I'll begin by sketching some of the ways in which this man's collection came into being. Then we'll talk about 3 different ways that he put it to use: as a repository for consultation, as a reservoir for new publications, and perhaps most importantly, as a source of political power, something that we might not expect a library to be, but for him was quite important. Oppenheim's collection was built, perhaps not coincidentally, at a moment in which the new science of bibliography began to take hold across Europe. In fact, terms like library and bibliography had only been coined in the 17th century itself. It was the 17th century that saw the rise of all kinds of collecting activities in the service of political power. French kings and German nobles, as well as amateur Italian scientists and English gentlemen, produced collections of artifacts and books that they would display based both on personal curiosity, but also as symbols of knowledge and power. This was in part fueled by new movements of the Renaissance era, Mediterranean exchanges between Christian Europe and the Ottoman East, as well as, of course, the marvels of discovery from the New World across the Atlantic. The need for such assertion of knowledge and power together was particularly acute in Central Europe, especially in the wider Holy Roman Empire and under the Habsburg monarchy that the Czech lands at that time were a part of, where 3 decades of conflict, the 30 Years' War with its auspicious or perhaps inauspicious beginning with the defenestration of Prague, that 30 years of war had upended all sorts of alliances and had destroyed economies. When the fighting had come to a close in 1648, emperors, electors, princes, and noblemen and bishops undertook to rebuild and refashion their regimes. And in the absence of their pre-war creditors and fearing competition from other nobles, they often turned to for economic aid to political outsiders. You won't be surprised that these were Jews. Jews were prepared to take economic risk in exchange for opportunity. These risk takers belonged to some of the wealthiest strata of German Jewish society, beneath which were numerous paupers and middle-class merchants of all different levels of the economic ladder, but a small subset of the Jewish population was one of means and wealth, and they came in time to be known as court Jews, on account of the services that they rendered to primarily German and imperial and Habsburg noble retinues. And the subject of our talk this evening, David Oppenheim, had the fortune, and I mean that word quite literally, had the fortune to be born into one of the most prestigious of these families, which included Samuel Oppenheimer, the one that you see on the right there, the left, who was the court Jew to the emperor in Vienna, as well as all kinds of financiers of lower rank, but still great significance to economic life in Heidelberg, Frankfurt am Main, and Worms. And the wealth and status of this family enabled them to afford every educational opportunity for their sons' training in Jewish tradition and texts. And this education, in turn, fueled his desire and his curiosity for collecting. Oppenheim began his studies around the age of 4 in the town in which he was born, in the Western Holy Roman Empire, in Worms, or Worms, I guess we'd pronounce it in English, and then engaged in significant travel across the Western Holy Roman Empire under rabbinic masters in Metz, Friedberg, and Landsberg, a circulation of educational travel quite similar to what young Christian nobles of his age would engage in, a kind of grand tour of study to different educational centers. Travels of this sort were part of a young man's, very seldom a young woman's, but part of a young man's education and upbringing in wider worlds of learning about other people's book collections and what they held, and Oppenheim was no exception to this. When precisely his thirst for collecting began, we can't know. We know that his parents owned books. We know that he credits his father and his mother with a house of learning and study, and credits his teachers as well, all of whom were deeply interested in seeking out books and manuscripts. But it's difficult. I would challenge any of us to pick a precise moment when we have our very first book. I certainly don't remember when mine was, and I'm actually quite happy about that. I'm glad that it was even before I had memories of my own, and I suspect that the same would be the case for Oppenheim. What we do know, however, is that at a certain point, he began to think self-consciously about himself as a collector, and that moment was probably around the time of his wedding. In the year 1682, at the age of 17, Oppenheim was married, or perhaps I should say married off, to the daughter of a court Jew from Hanover in the northern part of Germany, a woman, or young woman, perhaps even a girl at the time, by the name of Genendel. And it was at this time that Oppenheim received books as gifts and began to impose order on this library. In order to do this, he turned to a book that he had owned for at least 6 or 7 years. It was something of a student's notebook. This is the student notebook that was first dated for Oppenheim in the year 1675, when he was merely 11 years old. It was a notebook that was designed for calculating the calendar and when the lunar months would be. That was part of the curriculum of young men in their yeshiva education. There are countless beautiful examples of books of this nature that are wonderfully illuminated. I'm sure you can see along the bottom the almost smiley or perhaps mocking faces that are all part of the playfulness of this genre. But this was, more than anything else, a notebook. And so Oppenheim took the blank pages at the end of the notebook 6 years later when he was married and began to turn it into a catalog. Began to turn it into a list of the books he owned, and we're quite fortunate to have this item surviving to this day. On the 63rd page of this item, Oppenheim repurposed this notebook and turned it into a personal inventory. He began it with an introductory poem. With good fortune, the books that I have bought with my wealth to honor my God who formed and acquired me, so that I have organized them by letter in order, each letter in its vessel and quarter, so that the finder may find, with facility at hand, any book which is missing from the land, and may God grant me to collect and accrue them, that God's Torah in Israel may spread far and wide, to make books to no end, and to sustain us and speedily bring the days of the end. Amen, amen, amen. This is, to the best of my knowledge, one of the earliest pieces of Oppenheim's writing, and it included some playfulness. Particularly this verse, to make books to no end, was meant to invoke the biblical phrase from Ecclesiastes 12:12, in which the author of the biblical book warns his readers, or warns his addressee, "Furthermore, my son, be admonished, of making many books there is no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh." What was in the biblical book an admonition was taken up by Oppenheim instead as a challenge, a goal to be met, one that he set for himself to make and produce and reproduce and circulate books to no end. And that became a life goal for him. The pages of this catalog are, to my mind, particularly exciting because Oppenheim enumerated and inventorized his books not once, but rather twice. As he laid out in his introductory poem, he organized each and every one of them alphabetically, so that this would be a handy reference guide. One could search, he could travel to different places, and we'll come back to that soon, and search catalogs or the shelves or stacks or stables of books, and be able to quickly figure out if he already owned or did not yet own this book. But I think the catalog is even more interesting for a second option. After dedicating a single page of the Hebrew alphabet to each page of this book, he then listed all of his books a second time over. And this is a treasure for historians, especially historians who are interested not just in the world of the rich and the famous and the powerful, but also all of the other levels of society that they came into contact with. Oppenheim listed a second time the source of each of his books, the person that he bought it from, the occasion upon which he received it, and in many cases, if he paid for it, the very price that he paid for it. The catalog is almost like a who's who or a where's where of how one would acquire or purchase Jewish books in a time before our own, in a time before there were Judaica stores, in fact, before there were many bookstores at all. Oppenheim gives us a sense of where books would come from. The pages of his catalog reveal contacts with book collectors in his own or book vendors in his own city and far beyond as well. For example, in 1686, he tells us he spent 2.2 Reichstaler on a purchase of 10 volumes from a vendor right there in Worms. 2 weeks before the Jewish New Year, before Rosh Hashanah, in the autumn of 1686, he bought almost 100 items from a man named Zanvil of Mannheim, who was a scribe who doubled as a bookseller. And perhaps we shouldn't be surprised that scribes, copyists, would also be selling other books at that. But official vendors of this nature were not the only way that Oppenheim acquired books. Ad hoc sales by the poorer to the wealthier were often an important source of him purchasing books and of revenue for people who needed it. In fact, one particular subset of the population is significant for us: people who liquidated the estates of others. And these were most often widows whose husbands had passed away, who sold off parts of their husbands' book collections, telling us something about the different gendered relationships to Jewish and Hebrew books in a time before our own, especially when women were predominantly excluded from the domains of study, but were still deeply involved in the circulation and movement and mobility of books, a kind of recovery of a hidden or unsung role for women, even though they may not have been the direct participants in the authoring of books or even their study. Without their role to play, those books would not have moved from hand to hand either. Thus, on the 6th of April, 1688, Oppenheim tells us that he bought 37 volumes for his collection by purchasing them from the widow of one Joseph Halevi. In September of 1691, he bought 19 more from the widow of Avram or Abraham Stern of Worms for a sum of 20 Reichstaler and 12.5 Batzen. These small-scale book collectors tended to be far more modest in their holdings. Virtually all of them were printed in about the century before Oppenheim purchased them, and they were items that were relatively available. But still, they tell us something not only about Oppenheim's own library, but also about the collecting proclivities of what we might call ordinary Jews in his time as well. And so peering through his larger collection, we actually get to catch a glimpse of smaller libraries at that. I'm going to take this back a slide just for a moment. On each of these slides, what you can hopefully see on this list are lists, are row after row. And the actual contents of what it says on each row, to my mind, is not immediately, we don't need to decipher them in this moment, but what I'd like you to see is that each and every one of these objects are pages from books in Oppenheim's collection in which previous owners of books wrote their own little inventories of the books that they owned. In the middle, those 3 rows alone tell us that one family owned but 3 books. Others own 17 or 25. And through them, we can begin to get a sense of what average or ordinary homes full of, or not so full of books were like at that. Not just the grand of thousands of books, but also in the single digits or in the tens, and get to see the diversity of book ownership. In time, as Oppenheim became more wealthy and more famous, he began to travel or send emissaries beyond his particular locales. In 1687, he dispatched a tutor from Worms to Frankfurt, to the Frankfurt Book Fair, to survey the new crop of recently published items. Later, when the book trade's center of gravity switched to Leipzig in the east, he would occasionally travel there himself in person, leaving his rabbinic post in Prague, and we'll come to that in a moment, to jostle among the hundreds of sellers and thousands of buyers, Jewish and non-Jewish alike, who participated in this annual affair. Still other books entered the collection in a kind of what we might call on-demand production, once again through scribes, copyists, whom he would pay to copy individual volumes for him. One crucial hub for this activity was in northern Italy, in Venice and nearby Mantua, under the leadership of two Kabbalistic masters, one by the name of Moses Zacuto and the other by the name of Benjamin Cohen. They operated a scriptorium in northern Italy, and it was an important agent in the spread of Kabbalah from the land of Israel and Italy into Europe north of the Alps. One of the products of this school, a scribe by the name of Azriel of Krotoshin, originally from Poland, was very important in reproducing texts for Oppenheim, and at least 40 of the items that are in this collection, the collection that still survives in its entirety today, bear traces of this copyist's touch. This young copyist did more simply, though, than replicate texts. He also engaged in an active Jewish cultural translation, as he transliterated works from a Sephardic, that is to say, Mediterranean Jewish hand, to an Ashkenazic, or Central European hand. All Hebrew characters, but different styles in print, what we would call different fonts of writing, that different eyes, depending on the region of Europe, North Africa, the Mediterranean, would be accustomed in different ways to reading. It tells us something about Oppenheim's special preferences for reading and his rootedness in particular Central European contexts. Now, this library became increasingly important. As Oppenheim matured from a young student into a scholar of independent standing. By the year 1691, he had received a prestigious post at the helm of the Jewish community of Nikolsburg. That's what he calls it in Hebrew as well, or Mikulov. And in time, the entire regional association of the Jews of Moravia had appointed him to be their chief rabbi. Just over a decade later, in 1703, he was awarded the chief rabbinate of Prague. At that time, Prague was the largest urban community of Jews in all of Christian Europe. It was the most coveted position, and he likely was awarded this position both on account of his erudition and learning, and not unlikely because of his family connections to some of the most important offices of the emperor that was also essential in providing or deciding or approving who would receive such a post. On the screen before you are some of the contracts that were issued to Oppenheim by the Jewish community of Prague, and some of you may be familiar with one of the emblems of Prague, the Star of David with the hat within it, was something of an icon or emblem of the Jews of the 16th, 17th, 18th century Prague community. Becoming chief rabbi turned Oppenheim into something of an administrator in addition to a teacher. As head of a yeshiva, an academy of higher learning, he used his library as a resource from which to draw materials for his regular lectures that he would deliver to assembled young men. In order to prepare his lectures, he took recourse to at least 11 printings of the Talmud in some 16 complete sets, numbering 248 volumes. In addition to these, he owned numerous tractates that had been published individually, as well as commentaries and super commentaries on the texts of the Bible, rabbinic commentaries on the Talmud that had been written in the Middle Ages, and the growing print library of legal compendia, codes of law, and responsa. But Jewish life was not just dictated by study of the Bible and Talmud. It was a living, evolving, and continues to be a living, evolving institution. Most Jewish communities organized themselves around bodies of law that evolved in time, that derived not just from their understanding of divine mandate, but also communal agreements. And rabbis played a role in this process as well. They were often consulted for their legal opinions, or at least their interpretations of laws that communities had made to govern themselves as autonomous communities in different parts of Europe. And Oppenheim was no exception to this. For example, the statutes of the body of law of all of the Jews of Moravia, which were primarily directed towards criminal codes, tax collection, paying matchmakers, and all kinds of different daily quotidian matters like that, were stored in Oppenheim's personal keep. This was something that had never been done before. Traditionally, they had been kept in Nikolsburg, but in 1697, Oppenheim was entrusted as keeper of the texts of these statutes, a function that had never before been entrusted to the chief rabbi, that was clearly a testament to a growing reputation that this was a man who not only appreciated books, but was the best kind of caregiver for them. His library soon became a wellspring of information not only for his own uses, but also for other contemporaries across Europe. On the screen before you, you can see one of the surviving letters that we have that are part of his collection. And if you look just towards the bottom, you can even see the wax stamp seal that was on this letter. It's quite a remarkable thing to be able to hold these letters in one's hands and really get a sense of the culture of communication of the era. Rabbis across the region, across much of Europe, from Amsterdam, across the German lands, Poland as well, possibly even as far as England, would write letters requesting copies of pages, copies of entire volumes, or perhaps the opportunity to come and visit the collection to see it themselves. Oppenheim's relative, who lived in Prague for most of his life, his name was Jacob Rischer, or Rezhav, and he was one of the chief justices of the Prague Jewish court. In many of his writings, we'll say things like, quote, "I found and saw in the responsa of such and such a manuscript in the noble collection of my in-law, the great David Oppenheim." And others would write in a similar fashion. In 1709, we have a surviving letter from 1709 where he receives a request from a man in Halberstadt who was in the process of composing his own commentary to a part of the Talmud. And he requested to come and visit Oppenheim in order to consult manuscript editions of the Talmud that had been produced before the age of print in the hopes of discovering perhaps a textual variant that printers hadn't noticed that might allow him to interpret or consider a different way of interpreting the Talmud than had been done in the centuries prior. The author of a book of customs, which was a particularly new genre of writing of the late 17th century, similarly viewed a manuscript in Oppenheim's collection and wrote about it that, quote, "it is still not printed and can be found in the bibliothèque of the famed sage." And I like that quotation because even just the word bibliothèque is interesting to me. At this time, Jews didn't have their own native Hebrew or Yiddish word for library. Instead, they had to use a loan word from I guess the French instead. The contemporary Hebrew word for library is sifriya. That's a 20th century invention, not something that belonged to the lexicon of Jews in Oppenheim's era. And so sometimes the library was referred to as a treasury, sometimes as a bibliothèque, most often just as a precious, just my books was the way that he would talk about them. And indeed, they were first and foremost his books, for despite the fact that he would allow others to see them, Oppenheim himself always maintained a privileged, semi-exclusive relationship to these books. When corresponding with others, he would often say, "I searched my collection and found such and such a manuscript," or perhaps even annotations in a printed book that no one else has access to. In his discussions, he would pepper his opinions with quotations like, quote, "I shall not withhold that which I found in my house of treasures in books which were written but have not yet been published," indicating that he held unique material to which only he was privileged, and the absence of which made the ruling of others, colleagues and competitors, somewhat lacking. Thus, when a controversy erupted in the northern German town of Hamburg that engulfed the rabbis of Central Europe in assessing, wait for it, whether a chicken that was found to be without a heart could be considered kosher, or whether such a chicken could ever have existed at all, a burning issue in the first decade of the 18th century that engulfed rabbinic opinions all over the continent, Oppenheim mailed in, quite literally, his decision by referring obliquely to finding a quote-unquote ancient compendium in manuscript which aided him in making his rulings in a way that others could not. And so he thus cultivated an image of almost complete identity between the man and his library. What you see on the screen in front of you is the title page of a manuscript that was copied for Oppenheim, and I've blown up just the image there. This is a kind of artistic rendition of the man himself, and there he sits with his finger over the book, a quill and ink in front of him, and a kind of pseudo-biblical verse, a verse that reads, "And David sat upon his royal throne," which to the best of my knowledge is not a direct quotation from the Bible, but is one that could have been from the Bible, is a kind of homage, not a mimicry, but an homage to a biblical verse, associating the David of the 18th century with his namesake, the biblical King David at that. And very often in his own writing, and certainly in the writings of others, he was often associated with that grand figure of Jewish antiquity, King David. And we're going to get to some of the ways in which he was really quite like that. Oppenheim was related to men of great wealth, or to families of fortune, not just men, but men and women of great wealth. And so people would often appeal to him to aid them in their different material needs. And the key to his heart was often the gift of a book. Numerous letters in his collection say things like, "I need your help for charity, for establishing a study house, for aiding me in gaining a rabbinic post in a far-flung community, and I do know that you are a lover of books, and so I enclose here a book for your enjoyment." So far-flung was Oppenheim's network of charitable giving and receipt of precious books that the Jews of Jerusalem would regularly send him across the 1690s, would send rare manuscripts that they believed, quite rightly, that were not a part of any Central European library, but were rather part of Mediterranean Sephardic libraries. At a certain point, they were so enamored of Oppenheim that they offered him a position. They invited him to come be the chief rabbi of the Ashkenazic Jews of Jerusalem. And while Oppenheim demurred at the invitation, he opted instead to take a different role and a different title. He became their charity officer and received from them the honorific Prince of the Land of Israel, Nasi Eretz Israel. Thus, the 18th century Prague Rabbi David, in effect, had found a crown for himself, not unlike the biblical David as well, and was referred to in a kind of royal tone as well, which I can assure you was none too pleasing to the imperial offices in Vienna, who were not at all excited about the idea of Jewish royalty in the city of Prague. But that's something of another story to be told another time. I do want to draw also attention to the materiality of the item on the screen in front of you. When Oppenheim was offered this position, he didn't just take it on privately, he made sure that the Jewish reading world knew about it. He took the letter that was sent to him in the post, or rather in the hands of an emissary from the Jews of Jerusalem, and had it printed. And had it printed not just on a small piece of paper like this, but rather on a large poster-sized broadside, and had multiple copies. I suspect something like 300 copies run off, and many of them are still in his collection, so I'm not sure how far they traveled, but certainly they were designed to harness the power of media, the power of the press, in order to amplify Oppenheim's reputation. This was recourse to a different kind of book culture that we tend not to think about when we think about the past, but I think those of us living in the present are quite primed to think about the variety of ways that media work. We are surrounded by media. We are assaulted, super saturated by media. It affects so very much of our lives. And Oppenheim had a savvy, very canny understanding of how media worked. Within his collection as well, we have wonderful relics or artifacts of these different forms of media, these large broadsides that were designed to either share news or perhaps operate as home decor of a certain sort. In fact, the item on actually both of these are designed to be for home decoration. They say on them, these are objects to beautify the home. To my eye, they are not necessarily what I would qualify as perhaps the most elaborate sorts of posters, but they were part of a kind of poster visual culture of Jews. And some of them are, of course, much more interesting than that. This is a large broadside that depicts the land of Israel. This is one that looks, to some people's eyes, it may remind of the Kabbalistic circuits or Kabbalistic circles of the students of Jewish mysticism. It actually is somewhat more mundane than that. This is a grammar chart that was designed to be posted in schools of boys who were learning Hebrew grammar. It's not perhaps the way that I would elect to learn grammar, but is once again an artifact of a time before our own and a media culture before our own. The Oppenheim collection, I think, is particularly remarkable precisely because it doesn't just preserve the world of elite male learning, but also Oppenheim's omnivorous collecting activities mean that he preserved within the collection books that were designed, or media that was designed for lowbrow consumption, as well as middlebrow consumption. He is one of the few that we know of, in some cases the only one that we know of, that collected cheap Yiddish literature that was produced, designed, and marketed primarily towards women and unlettered, uneducated men. And it's actually thanks to Oppenheim's collecting activity that we know very much about this entire field of Jewish literature at all. A field of literature outside of the circle of rabbis, but authentically Jewish, that tells us about the leisure habits, the information habits of middle, ordinary, regular people. These are different songs. One tells the story of a fire in Hamburg. One is a kind of polemical text designed to fortify Jews against the, against the temptations of conversion, for example. Some of them are designed for ritual ends. This is a prayer to be uttered by women in the cemetery in the weeks before the Jewish New Year over particularly unmarked burial spaces for those who had perished in plague in the previous years. It accompanied a kind of ritual where women would take the rope or string for wicks, for candles, and they would measure it against the length of tombstones as they would utter these prayers, and then they would turn them into commemorative candles afterwards. So once again, we gain a portrait that is not just about rabbis of the highest and wealthiest order, but rather across gender lines, across economic lines, across calendar times, life cycles from start to finish, and remembrance. Sometimes these could be quite beautiful. Oppenheim's collection certainly allowed him to hire individual illuminators who would decorate items like this Passover Haggadah that you see in front of you. It wasn't printed in color, but rather he hired people who afterwards would illuminate it. He was, after all, from a family of people who lived in the ambiance and the environment of emperors and courts who understood conspicuous consumption and the display of beauty, and this was no exception. Visitors to the Jewish Museum in Prague will encounter Oppenheim and his family members' names on donations to synagogues from the 17th and 18th centuries, to covers of Torah scrolls and other objects of beauty that all contributed to Jewish ritual life in this time. In 1703, Oppenheim relocated to Prague. Except Prague was, at this time, a major center of a Habsburg campaign to Catholicize or re-Catholicize Bohemia with the help of the Jesuit offices. And although Jews were not the direct target of this effort, it was instead directed towards Reformed Christians, especially those who followed the Hussite tradition, it did have important implications for Jews as well. Throughout the late 17th and early 18th centuries, Jewish books came under the watchful eye of censors, and Jews were often forced to attend conversionary sermons at that. Oppenheim sensed this tense environment and opted not to bring his books with him to Prague, and instead he secured their rights of residence in the home of his father-in-law in Hanover, in northern Central Europe. His father-in-law was an influential man. His name was Lefman Behrens, and he was essential in gaining important titles for his patron, the Elector of Hanover, who eventually gained a crown of his own, becoming King George of England. That's not Oppenheim's father, but rather Oppenheim's father's patron. And we even have letters of correspondence between Oppenheim and the man who eventually became the English king at that. He moved in the highest possible circles. And so the man and his collection were separated, but I actually think that this separation was something of a benefit. In the absence of the direct presence of the two, Oppenheim needed a professional staff and professional catalogers, and those are a gift to us and to history, because without them, this man and his idiosyncratic way of organizing books would be lost to us. But because he needed order that was somewhat separate from him, he has left to us a library that makes sense. In the year 1713, a year that would eventually be a year of plague, a Christian visitor to the collection, wrote to colleagues to tell them about the wonderful things he had seen. He says that he visited this collection in Hanover, and although the owner was not present, his son-in-law showed me around at all civility. The old cantor of the synagogue showed me the most noteworthy of the books. Among the printed volumes, one can find an astonishing quantity of Bibles, all of the editions of the Talmud, prayers printed from entirely unknown locations in small villages, among other books. He showed me an item of the Bible written on large parchment consisting of the Torah, the prophets, the writings, probably a very ancient age, and a similar one in small format, written very neatly for a wealthy Jew a few years ago, with the Masorah in the margin, and on every side in special fashion, borders, lines, leaves, animals, and fish, some of them microscopic. Perhaps he looked at a volume like this, or others of its nature which abound in the Oppenheim collection. In time, Oppenheim used the collection also to fuel not just his collecting of books, but the printing of more books at that. He lent financial support, reputational support, and even, we're going to come back to this in a moment, and even manuscripts from his collection to run off of the presses in print. The item that you see before you is one of my absolute favorite. This is a 1705 printing of the Bible with, for the first time, a medieval commentary, a medieval Jewish commentary, Hebrew commentary, that is, in the modern period, quite a canonical text, but had never ever been printed before. References were known to rabbis and scholars because they had seen citations and quotations, but the text itself had been assumed lost. Until Oppenheim, as he reports in the opening pages of this edition, tells us that he discovered a lost manuscript in the attic of a synagogue in his hometown of Worms. He says the manuscript was nibbled at by mice. He tells us about climbing up a ladder to the attic of this building where he encountered these items, and he thanked God that it was stored in an attic rather than buried in the ground, when it would have been lost to all. Oppenheim at first didn't want to publish this book, but friends prevailed upon him, and in a kind of collaboration between Jewish books and Christian printers, this item was printed thanks to the court preacher of the rulers in Berlin, and the book found wide purchase, and now elements of it are part of the contemporary curriculum today. Where is this library now? Let's conclude by talking about where the library is now. The answer to that question lies partly in the twists and turns of fate. David Oppenheim died in the year 1736, having lived a relatively long life of 72 years. His son Joseph, who was the immediate heir to the library and worked as its librarian in Hanover, survived his father by only 3 years thereafter. And so within a very short time, this library that had once been so dear to a family was something of an orphan. The library's ownership passed to Oppenheim's granddaughter, Joseph's daughter, and she and her husband, who lived in Hildesheim. But as was quite common for families of fortune in risky and precarious positions of loaning and crediting, the once innumerable riches of the family that had brought the library into being had by this time waned. And after a few years, Oppenheim's heirs commissioned an appraisal of the library in order to use it as collateral against the loans that they then needed. And so his granddaughter Genendel solicited the opinions of leading experts, names that perhaps may be familiar to some in this room, chief among them Moses Mendelssohn, the father of Jewish Enlightenment, who personally visited the library and recognized immediately its grand significance. Mendelssohn suggested that the price of, quote, 50 or 60,000 Reichstaler would certainly not be too expensive to pay. And while others were more hesitant to put an actual price tag on this remarkable collection, they confirmed that the value of the library was exceedingly great and that its worth was not only for Jews but also for Christians, not merely in Germany, but rather for all of Europe. Before a buyer could be found, however, a relative of Genendel's appears to have paid off her outstanding debts, and the library then moved to the city of Hamburg. The move of this library from place to place was roughly contemporaneous with events that dramatically reshaped the political and civil position of Jews everywhere, namely the movement for emancipation that began with the French Revolution and reverberated across Europe in different forms and edicts and legal arrangements in the 19th century that followed. For some, the library was proposed as an agent of a new kind of Jewishness, perhaps as a mode of Jewish reform. When a republic was established by Napoleon's armies in Westphalia, a kind of consistory of Jewish affairs was put into place, and the president of this Association for Jewish Affairs lobbied to purchase the library in the hope that Jewish culture might be remade and reformed for a new modern era. And yet these efforts came largely to naught. Instead, the library was once again prepared for sale, for a kind of public auction. And this entailed the organization of a catalog, catalogs like you see in front of you. In fact, every time an idea came up to sell the library, a new sales catalog was produced. And each time a catalog was produced, it was organized in a slightly different fashion, sometimes alphabetical, sometimes thematic, sometimes by size of the books themselves, which tells us something, again, about changing conceptions, even a very brief period of time, about libraries and books and knowledge and how we approach them as people. This auction was scheduled for June of 1827, and this catalog that you see right here was printed in 1826 in anticipation of the 1827 auction. But by late 1826, the professor of Hebrew at the University of Oxford and the Bodleian Library had caught wind of the sale and dispatched and empowered an agent in Hamburg to place a bid on its acquisition. Following months of negotiation between the family and Oxford University's Bodleian Library, in May of 1828, the two parties settled on a sum of £2,080, which translated in that time to 9,000 Reichstaler, which is a far cry from Mendelssohn's 50 to 60,000 Reichstaler. Got it for a steal. And the library's contents were packed into 34 crates a year later in May of 1829 and arrived in Oxford that summer. And to our great fortune, we even have the documents of the negotiation. What you see on the screen in front of you are letters, this time written in English, back and forth between the Bodleian Library in Oxford and that agent. And the image on the right actually tells us how many boxes were in each crate, how many books were in each crate that were shipped overseas and that arrived in England in the summer or spring of 1829. Over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, a surprising number of scholars expressed disappointment that Oxford had become the home of this collection. In 1845, one of the grandest, most important leaders of Jewish studies, named Leopold Zunz, described the collection as follows. He said it, quote, belongs to the few memorials that Jews established and Christians preserve. As late as 1930, one scholar complained, quote, it cannot, with the best possible goodwill, be considered lucky for the library or for Jewish learning that fate has decreed Oxford to be the home of the Oppenheimer Library. He lamented that it was not in Germany, where he understood the lion's share of Jewry to be, and expected a still great future for the Jews of Germany. Fate had other plans. And so much as the twists of fate and chance had brought this collection into existence, strange twists of fate preserved it from the horrors that would befall Jews and their rich cultural heritage on the European continent a mere few years later. Today, the Oppenheim collection still stands in Oxford. There we go. Where it attracts the attention of scholars of Judaica from around the world, who come to marvel at its treasures and to use its contents to reconstruct the lives and literatures of Jews of ages past. Fields of study about medieval medicine, astronomy, mathematics, Yiddish poetry, devotional literature, and more are all nurtured by this collection, which holds items, many of which are unique, the sole surviving copies in the world. Benjamin closed his essay, Unpacking My Library, by saying the following: to renew the old world, that is the collector's deepest desire. Pacing through the stacks or carefully thumbing through the folios of the books in this collection, a world of encounters open up before the eye of the beholder. For some, these avail themselves to the reconstruction of a single school of thought, an intellectual phenomenon. But the collection taken as a whole guides us through individual fates of copies of books and the wider social, intellectual, professional ties they reflect, trends that belong to Jews and their neighbors alike. Taken in the aggregate, we can see both the trees and the forest, an understanding of the man who animated a collection in the service of scholarship and politics, a wider backdrop of women and men, Jews and Christians, artists and scribes, rich and poor, local and global, that converged in the making of this magnificent, enduring library. I thank you.